The Second Crusade has failed, but its end will open the door to the Plantagenets, that brilliant, avaricious, rebellious, murderous family that will dominate the history of Western Europe for a century to come. Here's their story, so riveting that we still are fascinated by it 900 years later.
Before we begin, I just want to say thank you to everyone who has been listening. This marks our first anniversary of Lion's Forge. I also want to say thank you again to Francis Butt for all of the amazing voices and richness that you have brought to this podcast. And a big thank you to Karen Markle-Nab for writing this incredible story and for allowing me the opportunity to tell it. Welcome back to Lion's Forge. My name is Becket, and I want to tell you a story, an epic, true story of 5 kings and the Lion Queen. Season 2, Episode 13. Let us restore the old affection between us. In the year 1169, on the Feast of the Three Kings, the day when baby Jesus received the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, Henry Plantagenet traveled in great state with his sons to the French town of Montmirail. Years before, on this same feast day, Henry Plantagenet had landed on England's coast to challenge Stephen of Blois for the English throne. Now, on the anniversary of that glorious day, Louis Capet had the pleasure of receiving Henry's renewed fealty for the immense Plantagenet holdings, stretching from Brittany to Toulouse. This was no little thing, at least not if you take seriously a chronicler's detailed account of what Henry pledged. He came, the chronicler wrote, as a supplicant to the French king, and offered himself, his children, his lands, his resources, his treasures, placed all under Louis's judgment to use or abuse as he would, to hold, to seize, give to whom he would as he liked, with no conditions stipulated or attached. Quite a series of concessions from swaggering Henry, who viewed himself as no one's vassal. And Henry's vow was redoubled when Louis also received the oath of fealty from Henry's eldest son, young Henry, for Normandy, Anjou, and Maine, and Eleanor's favorite, Richard, for the Aquitaine. Plantagenet territories in France now had 2 lordly masters, and only one was the young prince's father. Louis must have turned away from the ceremony with a profoundly self-satisfied smile on his face. He had just lanced the boil that dated back to the day Eleanor of Aquitaine married Henry Plantagenet. But fealty was always a slippery, wriggling thing. Louis's acceptance of Henry's pledges meant that Louis had publicly declared his trust in the untrustworthy Henry. The 2 rivals had just gotten married. It would not be a peaceful union. Riding away from Montmirail, Henry was no longer an energetic, idealistic young man. King for 16 years by now, he was the scarred veteran of a great many wars, mental and physical. He was tiring. The compelling woman who had brought him half his fortune and given him 5 sons now stayed away, preferring life in Poitiers apart from him. Thomas Becket, his best friend on earth, the boon companion of so many days in the bracing air of Normandy, had fled from him, writing shattering letters from exile about the evil that had consumed the English king. He had a lovely mistress half his age, a woman who would become legendary simply for sharing his bed, but he rarely saw her. He had his enviable family, those 4 living sons, now aged 15, 13, 12, and 3. But at Montmirail, he had lit a match to a powder keg of killing discord that would soon tear his family apart. All of Henry's other problems merely stretched, yawned, and sunned themselves, for the time being. But Henry's decision to crown his eldest son was about to fully awaken the old problem of Thomas Becket. It's certainly possible that Henry thought highly of the French tradition, that monarchs were crowned while young, well before their royal fathers died, thus putting a brake on sibling battles over inheritance. Perhaps envisioning his boy at the center of the pomp and ritual of the ceremony thrilled him. Perhaps he pictured an event that would reflect his own majestic adult grandeur. Perhaps it simply placed his heir on an equal footing with the crowned heir to the French throne. Henry seized upon the idea that young Henry should be royally crowned with all attendant ceremony. Regrettably, his desire ran headlong into the reality that the man who crowned English kings was the Archbishop of Canterbury. The presiding Archbishop was, of course, Thomas Becket. Becket had lived for years by now under the protection granted him by Louis Capet, backed by the Pope Alexander III. Safe in France, Thomas retained his archbishopric, despite Henry's considerable efforts to have him unseated. He was living in exile, but he was no powerless victim. He had his spies, and he had his vocal supporters. He also had a stage from which to issue scathing letters to and about Henry for worldwide consumption, including one blistering missive issued from the altar at Vézelay, which called Henry wicked and summarily excommunicated everyone who obeyed the despised constitutions of Clarendon. A sample of what came from his pen in those days says directly to the King of England, "Unless you come to your senses, unless you cease attacking churches and the clergy, unless you keep your hands from causing disorder among men, the Son of the Most High will indeed come in his fury in response to the sighs of captives and the voices crying out to him, because it is already time to pass judgment against you in the equity and sternness of his spirit. Truly he is terrible before the kings of the earth." Henry, infuriated, vented his prodigious temper by lashing out at anyone who was thoughtless enough to mention Becket's name. Bishops on both sides of the Channel felt caught in a vice, forced to declare for or against the immensely powerful Henry Plantagenet, and to assess where that left them with God. Fervent prayers must have been offered up every day that some kind of workable solution would be found. The Pope even felt moved to urge Matilda, the king's mother, to intervene. She complied. "For the remission of my sins," she said. But her efforts were directed at Thomas, not her son. She messengered a letter to him that chided,
"Henry so loved and honoured you, and appointed you lord of his whole kingdom and of all his lands, and raised you to the highest honours in the land, believing he might trust you rather than any other. He declares that you have, as far as you could, roused his whole kingdom against him. One thing I plainly tell you, that you cannot recover the king's favour except by great humility and most evident moderation."
That helpful advice was as wasted on Thomas as it would have been on Henry, neither being known for those particular splendid qualities. Things had teetered back and forth in this way during the last years of the 60s, an untenable reality. Not only was their bitter estrangement tearing the English church apart, but now Henry wanted his eldest son crowned, and the only man in the world with the acknowledged authority to do so was the one Henry hated the most. Driven by necessity, Henry swallowed his bile and agreed to several meetings with Thomas as the decade ebbed. Various European notables, including Louis Capet, tried to play mediator. There were outward gestures of amiability. Thomas fell to his knees in front of his king. The king chivalrously raised him to his feet. Henry invited Thomas to list everything taken from his estates during his exile, so that restitution might be made. Thomas vowed his personal loyalty to Henry. It sounds so promising, but Becket's biographer, Anne Duggan, says there was what she described as, quote, a terrible hollowness at the heart of the reconciliation. For his part, Becket reportedly had told Louis that after Clarendon, after Northampton, he would never again trust any Plantagenet pledge, no matter how apparently sincere. There was no longer any way past their crippling history. Archbishop and king went on circling each other like wrestlers, neither willing to yield. Despite all the superficial accord when they met, Henry would never grant the public kiss of peace, which normally brought such meetings to their happy conclusion. Thomas, in turn, obstinately insisted upon the supremacy of God's honor, of which he was the representative, over the will of any human monarch. Even Louis Capet, Thomas's chief protector, asked him in exasperation, "My lord, are you trying to be more than a saint?" This archbishop's colossal conviction that he was in the right never faltered. Nor did Henry's fury. The stubborn king was not to be deprived of his dream, and in June 1170, young Henry, eldest living legitimate son to Henry Plantagenet, was crowned and anointed heir to the English throne at Westminster Abbey. It was a spectacular event, the first of its kind in England, modeled upon the French tradition. However, it would turn out that placing a royal crown on Prince Henry's adolescent head was a very poor idea, and one can say that ideal auspices did not attend the day. The Archbishop of Canterbury, by revered ancient custom, crowned the kings of England, but of course this one would not be attending. The honors were performed by his chief rival, the Archbishop of York, a workaround devised by Henry. Nor were the young king's mother or wife in the audience, instead staying together at Cannes, not far from the Norman coast. It's unknown why the ladies failed to attend, some historians blaming the weather, some arguing that Henry tried to shield his daughter-in-law, certainly not his estranged wife, from the gossip steaming up from the irregular ceremony. Others, less charitable, assessed it a ploy designed to pressure Louis to force Becket to give up. While Louis Capet took his daughter's absence as a provoking insult, it might have been just as well she didn't make the trip. The weather during one crossing was so terrible that part of the royal convoy sank, taking some 400 wedding officials and guests with it. For her part, Eleanor may have stayed behind to protect her son, working to keep the channel ports closed to fend off any mischance that Thomas might make a surprise appearance in London. Even the Pope was involved. Alexander bravely stood up to Henry, sending letters forbidding any clerical participation in the prince's coronation on pain of interdict, that truly frightening papal weapon which imposed excommunication, absolute isolation from the comforts of religion, on everyone living in Henry's territories in both England and France. Mysteriously, the Pope's letters to England didn't arrive in time, but they openly stated a threat which made even kings blanch. The pressures were becoming too much, even for a Plantagenet. In July, a month after his son was crowned, Henry permitted himself to tolerate being in Thomas's presence again. The two met at Fréteval, on the edge of a great forest 100 miles south of Paris. The day before, Henry had reconciled with the French king over Louis's years of aid to that outlawed churchman. One old history says that Henry jokingly told Louis, "That rascal of yours shall have his peace tomorrow, and a right good peace shall it be." Indeed, when king and archbishop were face to face, these best friends from another life and another world, there seemed to be none of the expected frost between them. Henry appeared willing to compromise on every point, even proposing an entirely new coronation ceremony, where Thomas would crown young Henry as well as Princess Marguerite. In Thomas's own words, contained in a letter to the Pope, "Henry spoke for a long time with such familiarity that it seemed there had never been any discord between us. As I was kneeling at his feet after dismounting from my horse, he took hold of my stirrup and compelled me to remount, and said, with tears in his eyes, 'My Lord Archbishop, let us restore the old affection between us, and let us forthwith forget the enmity that has gone before.'" According to chroniclers, Henry assured Thomas that their ancient love for one another would be revived, with no backward looks and no recriminations. However, no kiss of peace was given, and they carefully avoided every one of the throbbing problems that lay between them, ranging from the return of Becket's estates to the existence of the constitutions of Clarendon. King and Archbishop spent the rest of the year, 5 wearying months, volleying back and forth over Thomas's promised return to Canterbury. Each step seemingly taken forward was quickly countered by a step to the side or the back. Henry became very ill within a few weeks of the Fretteval meeting, so near death that he made out his will. Communications accordingly stalled. Then, too, Canterbury was a very wealthy holding, the equivalent of any noble's. Its riches flowed into many hands, including Henry's. Those who benefited from Becket's absence were in no hurry to have him return, while Thomas himself, characteristically stubborn, insisted that he would only return when restored to every single right due to him. He would accordingly petition the crown for something, such as rightful income from the Canterbury estates. Henry would agree, but only after making some arbitrary tweak that would require yet another round of tiresome negotiations. One serious sticking point was the treatment of Henry's loyalists inside the church. Henry, for example, absolutely rejected the idea that the Archbishop of York would be disciplined for participating in young Henry's coronation. Thomas sent suspension papers anyway, deliberately casting renewed uncertainty over the very ceremony so important to the king. Aristocratic English thugs like Randolph de Broc, a king's officer who enjoyed management of the royal court's whores, openly robbed Thomas's belongings. Royal lawmen didn't even glance his way. Important letters came too late. Advisors were in the wrong city. Rumors, frightening rumors, took to the air. Petty insults bristled. There's an old story that when Thomas and Henry happened to attend the same church on the same day, Henry demanded that the officiating priest say a requiem mass, so the king wouldn't be forced to give the kiss of peace during the normal service. Historians still argue, who was Thomas Becket? There's quite an assortment of choices. Arrogant, tactless, obstinate fool, lately come holy man intent on martyrdom, lonely hero battling tyranny regardless of the cost. If he longed for martyrdom, he was going after it in a promising way. A bishop dying in defense of Holy Mother Church at the hands of a secular prince was hardly news, since one historian says no less than a dozen of them were killed just in pious France in the prior century or two. Yet Becket made the decision to leave French protection. In October, 6 weeks before he came back to England, he wrote his last surviving letter to Henry. The ending is colored by either true melancholy or self-pitying melodrama, as he wrote, "I shall return, perhaps to die." It was said that he dreamed of his death, Christ appearing to him to murmur soothing promises of saintly glory. Supposedly, both Louis Capet and even the captain of the boat that carried Becket back to England begged him not to go. Thomas knew what he was doing. In one of his final sermons, he made pointed mention of the martyr Alphege, an Archbishop of Canterbury 60 years before, captured by Vikings through a one-time friend's treachery and then savagely put to death. Despite all the fears, the dreams, the warnings, Thomas made his way to England at the beginning of December 1170. He had been gone for 6 years. His dealings with the king were still in dangerous disrepair and confusion. Whatever he had feared might await him, he returned to a hero's welcome. His 12-mile route from Sandwich to Canterbury was thronged with parish priests and their congregations, abbots and their monks, cheering common people waving him on. Henry heard reports of Thomas's joyous reception in the streets. He wasn't thrilled by the news. Nobles nervously avoided the man. Young Henry, seething over the cloud Becket had cast over his coronation, refused to meet with him. But a full choir, accompanied by organs and trumpeters, sang out joy as he entered Canterbury Cathedral. People seeing him again for the first time in so long must have been shocked at his appearance. The stress of the past 6 years had left him gaunt, pale, profoundly tired. He'd have no time to rest. December was a feverish month of emissaries, letters, malignant rumors, and grim-faced messengers, each day crackling with more tension than the one before. Men's blood was up. One memory holds that a member of Henry's court advised the best way to handle what he called such a traitor would be a new-made rope and gallows. What happened to Becket might not have been carefully plotted. It wasn't dictated or supervised. But it was no sudden mad impulse. The smell of Thomas Becket's death was in the air that Christmas season of 1170. Of course, we know how things turned out. Becket, never quietly docile, chose Christmas Mass to raise the ghost of Alphege the martyr from the dead yet again, and to summarily excommunicate all of the bishops who had participated in young Henry's coronation. He told the congregation outright that he'd come back to England to die for the freedom of the Church. 4 days later, December 29th, 1170, knights newly arrived from the royal Christmas court in Normandy bullied and harassed the unarmed but defiant Archbishop across the grounds of Canterbury Cathedral. They knew him well. 3 of the 4 had once sworn oaths of fealty to him. They probably guessed he wouldn't run or hide, that he'd be unafraid to the last moment of his life. They got to him in front of the altar, where they slashed his head to bits. One of their retainers even scraped Becket's brain from his skull onto the stone floor. Chronicler and Becket friend John of Salisbury was an eyewitness. And so, men come from holiday feasting with the English king, carrying weapons that could shred chainmail, assassinated the foremost prelate of the English Church as he stood on consecrated ground a few feet from the Blessed Sacrament, protected by the universal law of sanctuary. The world was aghast. The intensity of emotion the murder birthed is evident by the fact that hundreds and hundreds of years later, we still know the story, including the funeral party readying the corpse for burial and finding Becket's hair shirt alive with lice. Other signs of the man's self-flagellation and literal starvation were public knowledge within hours. Pope Alexander, who dreamed of the dead man dressed in robes the color of blood, refused to speak with an Englishman after word of Becket's death reached him, and turned Henry's royal embassy away. Within months, the Pope was petitioned to canonize the bishop a martyr saint. For the rest of his life and on into all the generations of human history to come, Henry Plantagenet, the most powerful and most feared king of his day, would have the murdered priest at his shoulder. Almost all that anyone knows of great Henry today is that he killed Thomas Becket. We've come to the end of our story for the time being. I am Becket Arnold, narrating from the book Lion's Forge, adapted for us by the author, Karen Markle-Nab. Thank you to Francis Butt for voicing our introduction and other players. If you like what you hear, please give us a rating, follow our channel, and share us with your friends. Most importantly, please join us again May 27th for the next episode of Lion's Forge, available everywhere you get your favorite podcasts, including on YouTube with video episode trailers. Visit us on Facebook, where you can ask questions, leave reviews, and interact with me. Until next time, thank you for listening.